The Denver Broncos are eager to get Sunday's loss to the Kansas City Chiefs out of their mouth, and they got to find a way to push forward as they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Where's this team's level of resiliency at? We'll analyze that and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it's your team every day. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making us your first listen. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. We appreciate you so much. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. You can check out my work over there, milehighsports.com, including film reviews on their YouTube page. You can also check out Sayre Bedinger, co-host of the show. He's the site expert over there, predominantly orange.com, as well as a writer over there, NFL Spin Zone. You can check out his work over there. And here's what you can expect on today's episode of the show. We'll wrap things up by talking about Audric Estime clearly taking over as RB1. We'll highlight that. We'll also take a look at the state of the AFC. After 10 weeks of play, the Broncos still in a playoff position here. But more importantly, we'll kick things off by analyzing how will the Broncos respond after Sunday's heartbreaking loss to the Kansas City Chiefs. We'll break that down here on today's show, which is brought to you by our friends over there at Ultimate Football GM. Sayre, my friend, big week ahead. Obviously, we went through the post-game report, processed that with everyone in Broncos country. Now the Broncos, they must flush it and focus now on the Atlanta Falcons, who, look, they're a playoff-level team. They got a winning record. They're coming to the Mile High City off of a loss as well, and Denver is going to have to find a way to take care of business.
Yeah, the Falcons certainly aren't going to try to help the Broncos get into the playoffs. So I think that when we look at this game on paper, man, it's an opportunity for the Denver Broncos to bounce back, to find their way back into a winning record above 500. That's what we want to see. And it's going to be a huge test because, look, you got blown out against the Baltimore Ravens. You responded well from that. You came back, played a really tough game against Kansas City, but to lose the way that you did against Kansas City, I mean, that can be so deflating, Cody, I think, for a lot of teams. But I think for this Denver Broncos team and where they're strong, they have a great opportunity to not just, I don't even think it's an upset. I think the early line is 1.5 points in favor of the Broncos this week. So we'll see how that adjusts over the course of the week. But in terms of record, be a little bit of an upset here. Can you get that chip on your shoulder and continue to play your game even after a devastating loss like we saw against the Kansas City Chiefs?
That's the thing you want to see, right, is what is the resiliency level in that locker room? Look, we caught up with Broncos head coach Sean Payton on Monday following the game, and one thing he told us is that the sky isn't falling after this loss. Certainly, the loss stings. He said, but the resiliency, he says that this team is resilient. Like his team, his 2024 Broncos team is resilient. And he said a lot of that has to do with their leadership. He says, I like their leadership, that it's different on this team this year than it was a year ago. And I think that's a promising sign when you consider the Broncos are young. They're considered that they're in the middle of a rebuild, so to speak. That may be accelerated a little bit. But I said it as well. You know, I think that a loss like on Sunday, it can either deflate your season, can completely suck the wind out of the sails, or it can push you in a new direction. And certainly the Broncos have an opportunity here to do just that. 6-4 certainly would have been nice to talk about this week, but Denver's at 5-5. Now you got to avoid losing 3 straight. You got to find a way to go 6-5. And then you have 2 more games before your bye week, 2 games that Denver can win those games and potentially go into their bye week at 8-5. We won't jump so far ahead, but how do you respond after this type of game? And I liked what Mike McGlinchey had said after the game, Sayre, in the post-game press conference. He said, if you're hanging your head after this and you don't belong in the NFL, he said, we lost and it's heartbreaking. We got to get right back to work. Malcolm Roach said, we got to go back to keep chopping wood. He said, we got to keep chopping wood, and we know what type of team that we are. We know where we're going to be. We know what this can do for us. And so I think the mindset of the players, while devastated from Sunday's game, they're very forward thinking and saying, hey, we have a lot that we can do, and we know exactly what our goals are. How we respond from that's going to be critical. And I think that's a great kind of picture painted about the culture inside the Broncos locker room.
And a reason to be confident in the fact that the Broncos can come back and be that team to bounce back and to stay focused and to not, wallow or let the wind be out of their sails. Like you said, we saw that their strengths return for this game against the Kansas City Chiefs. Remember against the Baltimore Ravens, it was like, man, what happened to the secondary back? What happened to the pass rush? What happened to the tackling? What happened to these guys? That was back in full force against the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
We saw that pass rush absolutely dominate. Patrick Mahomes had a rough time. The Broncos tightened up in the red zone, which was great to see. We saw the offense moving the ball, especially in the first half, not as much in the second half, but I mean, that's
time of possession.
Time of possession, right? Like we talked about on yesterday's episode, the Chiefs really kind of inadvertently shortened that game by extending a couple of their drives. So the Broncos didn't have a ton of opportunities with the ball, but man, they did everything that we saw them do well pre-Ravens game. They brought that back for the Kansas City game, and I was encouraged by it, Cody. I'm encouraged by the play of Bo Nix. I'm encouraged by the running game. I'm encouraged by the defense, the pass rush, especially when you're going up against quarterbacks like Kirk Cousins, whoever the Raiders are going to trot out there, and then Jameis Winston. You know that you are going to be able to get those guys flustered, and those guys will take sacks. And so I think that's the thing. This Broncos pass rush, if you're going to get to 8-5, if you're going to get 3 wins before the bye week here, that pass rush is going to be the key, the reason why it happens.
Yeah, and look, I think when you factor in that Kirk Cousins, even though, hey, he's playing great this season, not as mobile, and I think that's where the Broncos' favor kind of plays in terms of their pass rush and their secondary. I'm very curious this week who's going to match up against Kyle Pitts, who's going to match up against Drake London. I like how Denver matches up here, but then you get to see former friend Justin Simmons coming to town. But he and Jesse Bates is a safety tandem. That's a really good safety tandem on the back end right there. AJ Terrell at cornerback, obviously, is going to be a force there. Jonah Ellis gets to see his brother on the opposite side there. Obviously, a guy used to play. Caden used to play for Sean Payton in New Orleans. So this is a big test this week. And look, I think that the Broncos should definitely come into this game angry, pissed off, but more so focused. I think that's exactly what's going to happen, knowing just being around the players. I think that that's how this team will respond here on Sunday. The next 3 games, home against the Falcons, on the road at the Las Vegas Raiders, who are maybe trying to find themselves in a position. Could they potentially tank, trying to get Shedeur Sanders possibly there? And then obviously the Cleveland Browns at home, Monday Night Football. Former Bronco Jerry Jeudy comes to town there. Denver, based on if they respond well this week, they have a good chance, Sayre, as you mentioned, going into the bye week potentially at 8-5. We'll see what the measure is of this team here coming off of this game. A lot of good things that they did against the Kansas City Chiefs. Look, 14 points. People are going to say, oh, you only scored 14 points. Each game is different, right? 14 points doesn't tell the full story of the game for the Broncos offense. But we did see that, hey, Audric Estime moving forward. Cortland Sutton, Devon Vele, those guys making plays moving forward. Bo Nix, he is the guy for Denver. I think a lot of Broncos country is convinced that. So while their loss was devastating, there are some things that we can maybe gain about this team going forward. How do they respond? We'll find out here this Sunday. We'll break it all down here, Locked On Broncos. But one thing we are also going to take a look at here, Broncos country, the AFC this year has been very competitive. There's a lot of wins and a lot of losses across the board. But it's kind of top heavy here as we look at the state of the AFC after 10 weeks of play. Where do the Broncos stand? We'll highlight that as they're still in the playoff picture and more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at Ultimate Pro Football GM. And hey, Broncos fans, remember our great partner, Ultimate Pro Football GM. Well, they're back, and they've added a brand new amazing game mode that I need to tell you about. The game that has you step into the shoes of a football franchise general manager and lead it to glory now has a new head coach career mode. So on top of being able to build your dynasty with players and training camps, you have a brand new upgraded negotiation system. This fun and realistic game just got a lot better, and you can play it here today. If you already have it installed, be sure to do an update so you could try out the new mode. If you don't have it yet, download it right now because it's a must-have for all football fans. I know that you'll love it. Ultimate Pro Football GM, it's completely free. It has no ads and is 100% playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. And here's a special offer for listeners of Locked On Broncos. Use the promo code Locked On NFL all together, all caps, inside the game store to receive a free boost to your franchise. Make sure to get it, as this perk will jumpstart your play and give you the advantage that you'll want in creating a dynasty. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com, ultimate-gm.com, or look it up on the app stores. Ultimate Pro Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and the NFL season is ramping up as the push to the postseason is here. Week 11 is upon us in the National Football League, and the Denver Broncos open up as 1.5-point home favorites against the Atlanta Falcons. You believe they're going to cover the spread. You believe they're going to win on the money line. You can obviously play that inside of the FanDuel Sportsbook app. And new customers right now can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook gives you everything that you need to place your live bets on the NFL all in one place inside the app. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats. You can view live play-by-play and so much more on the same page where you place your bets, whether that's anytime touchdown scores or player props throughout the entire game. FanDuel is the place to be. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
Despite the loss to the Kansas City Chiefs, things are looking all right for the Denver Broncos in terms of the AFC playoff picture right now. Cody and I are going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some depth chart situations here with the Denver Broncos coming up on today's show. But first, I want to say thank you so much to all of you everydayers out there that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the show and help out your boys. You know, we got you every single day covering the Denver Broncos all year long. Cody, let's talk about the AFC right now after week 10, because obviously Kansas City, they're alone at the top. They have a matchup against Buffalo this coming weekend, which could be a preview of the AFC Championship game. Those are the top two teams in the AFC right now. But in terms of the Broncos, they entered week 10 as the 7th seed in the AFC playoff race. They leave week 10 as the 7th seed in the AFC playoff race. So maybe let's tell everybody here why there's not necessarily cause for panic at this point, despite another, I mean, it was an AFC loss. It was an AFC West loss. It's not good, but ultimately everything that transpired over the weekend kind of sets the Broncos up in such a way that they didn't lose all that much ground.
Yeah, it's not just about what the Broncos do here. Obviously, folks, it's more so what are some of the teams behind them doing as well, right? Obviously, Denver's got to win games. There's no discounting that. But you look behind them, who's in the hunt right now that could be creeping up upon them. If you look right now at the AFC standings, Sayre mentioned it. Kansas City's #1. The Buffalo Bills, #2. The Pittsburgh Steelers, #3. They're winning. They're rolling right now. The Houston Texans, even though they're starting to falter a little bit, they're the 4 seed. They'll likely stay there because their division in general, unless the Colts somehow come up there. And because of the division, the playoff structure, they're going to get in by default, even if they win the division and have a terrible record. The Ravens are right behind them. The Chargers at the 6th seed, and then the Broncos, they're at the 7th seed. Right now, I think the biggest focus here, the two teams Broncos need to pay attention to behind them, it's the Indianapolis Colts, who are 4-6. They're obviously on a little bit of a skid here. And then the Cincinnati Bengals, who are also 4-6, having dropped another game. These are two teams Broncos Country should be hoping for that those teams continue to lose, because really behind the Bengals, it's the New York Jets. We all know they're cooked. They're garbage. They're done. Really, I think it's a 2-team race right now for being in the hunt between those teams, the Colts and the Cincinnati Bengals here. And this week, I think one of the things we got to look at with the schedule, the Bengals are taking on the Chargers. This is the one instance Broncos Country you have to hope that the Chargers can beat the Bengals here, that they will beat that. That's what you want to hope for. That's what you have to root for here to help the Broncos' playoff chances. Certainly 5-5. That's it. Denver's there. They're 500. You want them to be above it. But if the Bengals lose, and if somehow the Broncos lose, it kind of balances it out, right? If the Colts lose, they take on the New York Jets, so you're hoping that the Jets win this week. But if the Colts lose and the Bengals lose, and even if the Broncos lose, they're still sitting there at that 7th spot. So it's not really moving there at that point. So it's kind of nice cushion to have, but the road to the 7th seed here really is the goal for the Broncos, Sayre. And I think that's more importantly where I think things should be focused. The AFC right now, very, very interesting. In your opinion, are you surprised about the AFC, like the teams that are ahead of Denver right now? I think the Chargers, even without all the weapons that like Justin Herbert doesn't have, they're playing really good football right now. They survived the Tennessee Titans in a little bit of a trap game there, unfortunately. But aside from that, it's like I'm not really surprised at how the rest of the AFC is looking right now. Denver's got to take care of business to stay in that 7th spot right now. That's the goal, in my opinion.
It is. And the Broncos are, I don't think it's altogether surprising where the AFC is at right now. I mean, certainly you figured that the Colts were a bit of a wild card, no pun intended, in terms of Anthony Richardson and his development, kind of just looking at that team as like overachieving last year at 9 wins with Gardner Minshew as the primary QB. So it's not surprising to see them hovering around, 4-6 right now. The Cincinnati Bengals are the surprise to me. I mean, the fact that they're 4-6 right now is a little ridiculous because they've got the NFL's leading passer, Joe Burrow. You've got Jamar Chase. You've got
He'd be the MVP if they weren't losing.
That's what I'm saying. I think that makes that team very scary. So that's why I kind of agree with you there when you say, hey, we want the Chargers to win. Let's keep handing the Bengals as many losses as we can, because at this point, I mean, man, that seems like the most threatening team behind the Broncos, and maybe the only threatening team behind the Broncos as of right now. So I think that where the Broncos are is in pretty good shape because there's a lot of time left. Even if the Chargers do win this weekend against the Bengals on Sunday Night Football, let's say the Broncos beat the Falcons and we go into that Chargers-Bengals game at 6-5, you're feeling a little bit better about things. I think no matter what happens against the Chargers and Bengals, I think if the Broncos are 6-5 after the Falcons game, I think you're sitting there saying to yourself, all right, this is a good situation to be in, because yes, the Bengals are lurking behind at 5-6, but that's still a 2-game lead over the Bengals.
Too.
You still got to play them. You got a head-to-head. And with the Chargers, that would put the Chargers at 6-4. So the Broncos have another game against the Chargers, and then you never know what can happen with the remainder of their schedule as well. So I'm fascinated by what's going to happen because the NFC is just way better than the AFC right now. I'm glad the Broncos are in the AFC this year. They have a clear path, Cody, with all the teams that are in front of them. I mean, you play the Chargers again, you play the Bengals, you play the Colts, you play the Chiefs again. Like, there's an opportunity to go and take that playoff spot. And that's what the Broncos, that's what we talked about, how important it is to bounce back against Atlanta. Sure, Atlanta's an NFC opponent, and it's just right now you've got to stack up the wins any way that you can get them. Who cares who you're playing? The Broncos need to stack them together and start with this weekend against Atlanta. It's pivotal that they win this game against the Falcons.
We highlighted the remaining part of the schedule, the next 3 games for Denver before their bye week. After the bye week, at the Colts, team right behind the Broncos right now. Then you're on the road at the Chargers, at the Bengals, who are behind Denver right now, and then home against Kansas City. Those are going to be those final 4 games of the season coming out of the bye. Like, that's how big this playoff picture is right now. But Sayre, here's the thing too, and I want to throw this question out to Broncos country, right? Because there were so many questions. Everyone had their thoughts on how many games the Broncos will win this season. I think it's safe to say, and we've been banging this drum the last handful of weeks, Denver's exceeded expectations so far. They're ahead of schedule as to where we thought, where a lot of people thought that they would be. Getting to the playoffs would be a huge success for this Broncos team this season. Look, we didn't say that, hey, they're going to go out and win the Super Bowl. Getting to the playoffs, ending that long drought that you've had since Super Bowl 50, that's a huge step in the right direction. Plus, then you go into the offseason with more salary cap space, your draft picks intact, and now you can build this team around Bo Nix. To me, that's the most exciting thing about the future. You want to get to the playoffs this year. That's fun. That's great. That's a huge step forward, but it's about the foundation beyond just this year for this Broncos team. The playoffs will be a nice little bump there in terms of their morale and the boost as to where they can be, and potentially could even make Denver more appealing when it comes to free agency, seeing the growth and where they're at. That's what I'm the most excited about with this team.
It's kind of reminiscent of the 2011 team, right? That was kind of playing with house money, the Tim Tebow year. You won enough games to somehow win the division at 8-8. You sneak into the playoffs, you win a playoff game, and all of a sudden you've got Peyton Manning's attention, right? And then he signs with the team, and all of a sudden all those other pieces that you had in place are elevated. And so it's not the exact same, obviously, but I think in terms of the Broncos being ahead of the rebuild schedule, because remember that 2011 team, they just picked 2nd overall in a lockout year. And so they were terrible. They were very bad. But they turned it around quickly, and you got those pieces. You got the right guys in the building. I think the Broncos have most of the right guys in the building, Cody. It's just adding those other pieces, like you mentioned. So it's crucial that this team proves that, hey, we're ready to compete. So we want these good players to come and join us. Like, we're ready. We prove we can hang with Kansas City, So that's where this Broncos team is at, and that's what's at stake.
Broncos country, let us know how you feel about Denver's direction and where they're headed under Sean Payton, Bo Nix. A lot of reasons to be excited. Even if the team is sitting here at 5-5, we're excited to break it down every single day here. Locked on Broncos. One thing we're going to dive deep into. It's very clear that rookie running back Audric Estime has taken over the running back one role here in Denver. What can we expect from him going forward? We'll highlight that and much more in today's episode. Locked on Broncos. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And right now, Game Time, they have a brand new feature they just launched called Game Time Picks, which makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks, they filter out the fluff to show you only the incredible deals that you can get on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. That's especially useful this week if you're trying to catch the Broncos rebound against the Atlanta Falcons on Sunday. You can go inside the Game Time app and find the best deals and prices on seats here today. Not only can you utilize Game Time Picks, but they also have all-in pricing where when you toggle the feature, it shows you your total up front. So when you go to checkout, you're not hit with any surprise fees. Plus, they have their lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. You can also view the seat view format inside to see exactly what the vantage point is going to be like of the game or the event you're planning on attending. So check it out today. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. As we jump on the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, Broncos Country, thank you so much once again for tuning in, making us your first listen. Special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. We want to know from you your thoughts on Audric Estime and his emergence in Sunday's game against the Kansas City Chiefs. What would you like to see more of here? Sayre, we got a chance to catch up with Broncos head coach Sean Payton Monday morning following Sunday's heartbreaking loss. And one of the things we were even asked about in terms of what we saw from Audric Estime, he said he's very pleased there. He even mentioned Marvin Mims and how they liked what they've done with Marvin out of the backfield a little bit. Certainly, I will agree with that. Not the end-around play. That's one thing I think everyone in Broncos country can agree about there. But when it comes to the running back position, this has kind of been leaning this way for a while now. It seems like Audric Estime is headed towards taking over those RB1 duties, which seems to be the case because I know we can't read too much into things like this. When you look at the total amount of snaps and carries that obviously Audric Estime had in comparison to Javonte Williams, and you look at in the final 2-minute drive there, where the Broncos, we should be talking about a victory instead of a blocked field goal, Audric Estime was in on that series there with Bo Nix and that offense on that crucial fourth quarter drive. To me, that kind of speaks volumes here about Estime going forward. What did you like about the rookie? I know we didn't get to talk too much about it in the post-game report because the loss was a little bit bigger, but I came away very impressed with what I saw from Estime. He held onto the ball.
Yeah, he's physical between the tackles. He's got better burst than I think that a lot of people would assume for a guy of his size. He's somebody that I feel as you wear out a defense over the course of a game, that he's going to be able to bust off big chunk gains because he keeps those legs going. He's very physical and he prides himself on creating those yards after contact. So really impressed by his game, Cody. Really impressed by that end of game sequence where, remember, he had that big run on that drive as well to set the Broncos up in Chiefs territory for that, their game, what should have been a game-winning drive. So he had a big run. He was being trusted by the coaching staff, which is great. I want to see more involvement from him as a receiver as well. I mean, that's part of playing the position of running back in today's NFL, and being a dynamic playmaker in that regard is, hey, when you're on the field, we're not just telegraphing that we're going to run the ball. We're going to try to throw this guy the ball at times as well. And I can't imagine wanting to tackle Audric Estime when he has a full head of steam out in space. So I think utilizing him as a weapon in that regard is great. I also love, like you mentioned, the Marvin Mims thing. I think that we talk about this when we're talking about guys who are disappointing this season or guys who have not lived up to expectations. Like, there's two routes that you can go. You can either bench the guy like the Broncos did with Greg Dulcich and keep him on the sideline, or you can say, all right, we haven't seen what we want to thus far, and therefore we got to figure out, us as coaches, like, what are we doing to set this guy up for success? Are we utilizing him the way that he can best be, effective for our team? I think the Broncos have done some soul searching, over the last couple of weeks with Marvin Mims, saying, like, we must be failing this guy because he's so gifted. When we see him in the punt return game, like, we've got to get him the ball somehow and get him involved. We can't just let him waste on this roster. I like the concerted effort to go get him the ball. I like manufacturing touches, getting him targets. I want to see more of that going forward.
Well, obviously, he and Audric Estime, you want to see that. Part of me is also wondering, too, with how they've been using Marvin in the backfield, is this Sean's way of trying to get the Joker role going here for the Broncos offensively? I mean, certainly I think it's something that we have to pay attention to and monitor, but part of me is also wondering, too, about the direction that this team can maybe go going forward. You know, if you're going to get Marvin involved in the backfield, how does this open up things in the receiving game when Josh Reynolds returns? How does this open things up when, you know, Troy Franklin's going to get more touches and more looks? Devon Bailey, we saw a little bit more of an increased workload from him. And even him getting involved specifically in the passing game, catching his first touchdown and even being an outlet option. I've loved what I've seen so far here. We'll have to see how things continue to progress here for him going forward and for this Broncos offense.
Just imagining all these young players getting the opportunity to lead this Broncos team to the playoffs, to kind of tie it back to our first segment and how important all these, like seeing Devon make the catches that he made against the Kansas City Chiefs and the touchdown. And I want to see more from Troy Franklin as well. But the young guys stepping up for this team, Cody, it's so exciting because it's coming at a point in the season at which the playoffs are within your grasp. So you have these young guys kind of coming of age. I know that a lot of people like to say at this stage of the season, like, you're not rookies anymore. You know, you've kind of already played enough games at the NFL level, but these guys are experiencing so much new every single week. And I love that they're getting, like, just think about how tight these guys already are and how much tighter they're going to be if they can push their way into even the 7th seed. Like, I know that doesn't seem like a lot to a lot of fan bases, but that would put the Broncos ahead of rebuild schedule. And it would prove to these young guys that, man, like, just imagine what we can do with more experience. Imagine what we could do when, you know, we're getting physically stronger and just better players overall. We're honing and refining our craft. Like, it's so exciting for this franchise. And like Sean Payton said before the year to the ownership group, like, this, we'll look back at this 2024 draft class as one that was able to propel us to really big things. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
I mean, you're seeing it play out. And certainly when you go back to Sean's quote there, it certainly is exciting. Obviously, there's a lot of groundwork that still needs to be made here for the Broncos, and I think there are a lot of different things that are going to appeal to them. But I think as we're seeing, like in the second half of the schedule, we're seeing a little bit more of an injection of the youth. I mean, Audric Estime is the youngest player on the team by a landslide. I think he just turned 21, if I'm not mistaken. Just barely turned 21. Meanwhile, you have some other vets on this team that are, you know, I think the oldest guy in the Broncos, if I'm not mistaken, is like 33, 34, something along those lines. Not bad. I mean, so it's like you have the influx of youth. You're getting them to buy into the culture, and the Broncos are competing with Kansas City. They're competing. We feel like they're, you know, them and the Chargers. The AFC West is starting to close the gap a little bit on Kansas City, as we've highlighted in the show. Certainly makes for some exciting opportunities down the stretch. Now you have free agency coming up. You can build this roster, maybe surround bonus, some playmakers, build the trenches a little bit, and also add in the NFL draft for the future. I'm excited to see what can come about this here for the Broncos. And certainly the loss on Sunday stinks. I think overall, the sun is still shining on the Denver Broncos and their season. As Sean Payton told us on Monday, the sky isn't falling. So we'll see how they respond this week here going forward. But Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show here, Locked On Broncos, wherever you get your podcast. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us, becoming an everyday listener, and to all the everydayers and first listeners out there in Broncos Country, you make the show exactly what it is. We appreciate you so much. And for tomorrow's episode, for all you everydayers, here's what you can expect. It's a mailbag edition, so make sure you stay tuned. Send in your Broncos-related questions. We'll choose the 3 best ones to answer. We'll break it down on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. We'll see you then.